So we're going to use technology here today to try to help you think about that at like a ranch or pasture scale, so you can find those clean parts of your pasture, start your conservation there, and then move out, so you don't get continually flanked by the problem.
Hi, I'm Dave Voth. I'll be your guide today on today's Good Grazing Makes Sense video. And today we're going over some of the issues with annual invasive grasses. And this topic gets beat to death quite a bit, I'm sure. At least here in northeastern Nevada, we have a cheatgrass problem here. And as a producer, I can use cheatgrass. I can get by with it. That doesn't mean that I like it, and I've been accused of being a cheatgrass cheerleader, and that's not the case. Given the choice, I'd much prefer a diverse pasture with deep-rooted perennials, shrub components. Holistically speaking, I think that is much better for the landscape. But while we're dealing with cheatgrass, I'm going to use it. So that's all I'll say about being a cheatgrass cheerleader. At a really high level, I think cheatgrass is a usable forage, and on the other hand, it's an extreme fire danger. So we've got these new tools coming out, and I'd like to always say that I look for the least mechanical solution or the least chemically invasive solution, but even I have to say, grazing's not going to get rid of cheatgrass on its own. Even with the most intensive grazing situation, eradication of cheatgrass through grazing alone, and I'm not even sure if grazing with chemicals would eradicate it, but to get a handle on it, we've got to start using all the tools in the toolbox and really attacking it more strategically. So today we're going to be talking with some folks about Range Analysis Platform. And I've had some experience with RAP, Range Analysis Platform, when making grazing plans. I think it does a pretty good job of estimating production, and a lot of times I'll put that production in combination with precip to get kind of an idea of what I could expect for the year. But we're going to be talking today about some new tools coming out through RAP with a focus on kind of a focus on defending the core, which really in a sense is keeping your perennials perennial, keeping those good spots from invasive annual grasses. We have had a tendency to respond and react to fire. Cheatgrass comes, a fire burns through it, and more cheatgrass comes, and then you get into a chicken and egg kind of cycle. But we're talking today about this idea, and I don't think it's necessarily a new idea, but some emphasis put on it, of defending the good spots that we have and keeping the annual invasives out, and in a shift from putting out fires, no pun intended, to building protection around those sections of our most favorable habitat. So I really enjoyed this discussion. I learned a lot, and as usual, I was not afraid to ask any stupid questions. So if you have any questions, stupid or not, put them in the comments, or get a hold of anybody from the Good Grazing Makes Sense team, and we will try to get them answered, not just for you, but for the whole Good Grazing Makes Sense community. Thanks. Enjoy.
I'm going to turn on layers like this that help us see basically the extent of invasion. So I could talk about that. We do have, Chad, I've got your EcoState maps here, which you're really familiar with. So these threat-based maps are a little bit more information. They're RAP derived, but kind of the condition of the ground. We talked, Chad and I, earlier about his expertise, just perspective on it's not 1850 anymore. These systems have changed. How do we need to incorporate that in our thinking of management at the ranch scale? I think would be good narrative here.
Yeah, and I think that really is important to kind of set the stage. Is annuals have changed everything for us. We don't live in 1850 anymore, and in a lot of ways, a lot of functional ways, practical ways, on the ground ways, the ecosystem that was existed in 1850 within the annual what is now the annual grass zone doesn't exist anymore. We've got a novel system that we're trying to work with here, and so to me that's important because it sets expectations right out of the gate. We're not trying to make cheatgrass become extinct, right? Where this is a chronic problem, and that goes to how we think about conceptualizing what success looks like, as well as thinking through what sort of investment we're going to have to make in this over time in order to treat that chronic problem. We don't have a cure, but we've got some treatments that can help us, and we've got some products like Jeremy's going to talk about with WRAP that can help us get there.
Yeah, technology, the breakthroughs over the last few years with remotely sensed vegetation data, and we're going to talk about the Rangeland Analysis Platform products, derived products, has given us a much better idea that this problem isn't uniformly distributed. Even in the Great Basin, where we assume it's everywhere, it's not as bad everywhere. And so we can use that information to our advantage in coming up with a plan. We're all guilty of like chasing problems around the landscape and basically just playing whack-a-mole, right? We just find the worst gully on the ranch, and we want to go treat that because it's horrific and we don't want anyone to see it. That problem is extremely hard to fix and takes a lot of resources. And the same could be said about invasive species. Once they're really widespread, it's extremely difficult to get a handle on it and take it anywhere near back to the level of productivity that you had before. And so what we're hoping to do with this, what we're calling the defend the core approach, it's this idea of really flipping the script on how we've tackled this problem in the past. So instead of going and chasing ambulances around the landscape, going to the latest burn and dealing with really invaded areas first, we're saying, why don't we take a look at where we have very little invasion now? Yeah, so we need to find the best parts of our pasture and start there. The old Ben Franklin ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we're going to use technology here today to try to help you think about that at like a ranch or pasture scale, so you can find those clean parts of your pasture, start your conservation there, and then move out, so you don't get continually flanked by the problem.
Yeah, and just tack on to that really quick, Jeremy. We tend to do annual grass management in inverse proportion to its likelihood of success. In other words, most of our efforts tend to be on those spots that we want to restore, because nobody likes seeing medusa head or cheatgrass on the landscape. When in reality, our success rates are going to be a lot higher if we focus on those areas that have an emerging problem and try to contain that emerging problem, keep that problem from getting worse. So it's kind of prevention and restoration. Prevention, we're going to be a lot more successful than we are once we get to the phase where we actually need to restore and bring back desired perennials into that system. And that's really the key there. Do you or do you not have the desired perennials left? The difference between the prevention and the restoration mindset.
We toss around this infographic a bunch when talking about this new defend and grow the core approach. But this is kind of how we view the landscape, and the remotely sensed data will show you these patterns. If you think about like the blue areas here on this figure, what we call intact cores, those are the places that aren't yet invaded, or they're invaded at a very low level. And then you got the yellow areas that are kind of slipping away, they're getting worse, and the problem's becoming more widespread. And then obviously you got your, Snake River Plain, your Battle Mountain, your places where you have really large infestations for very huge areas. And then we apply this medical philosophy on top of it, right? So we know that if you end up in the emergency room, the likelihood of success is lower, the cost is higher, and it's a very reactive position to be in. What if we could instead go to that annual checkup every year, check on our best ground, make sure the problem's not getting worse and spreading? And that type of a proactive approach is much more likely to be effective in the long run, given how fast this problem is moving across the landscape. And so keep this simple figure in mind when we dial into an actual map. And you guys tell me when you're ready to drill down, we'll just do it.
Sounds great to me. Yeah, I'm really excited to see this, taking it, like you said, from the conceptual level, it's kind of up here, and then drilling down at a ranch scale. This is awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure. Well, I'm going to dive into it. And Dave, you jump in whenever.
This question may be premature. Maybe you're going to get to it. I like the idea of this annual checkup. Is that something you're talking about that we can do remotely? If not, who can get that done? Is that something that you can do remotely?
Yeah, so the idea of the annual checkup, what would that look like? Some of it can be done remotely if you have a large piece of ground. We do have annually updated layers on the Rangeland Analysis Platform for functional groups like annual forbs and grasses. And so it is possible to see, even when you look at those maps that are on RAP, you can see fluctuations in annual plant growth that, in our part of the world where, Nevada, your part of the world, Dave, 8 to 10 inches of precip, you should not have a ton of annual grasses or forb production unless you're in a wet meadow or a really high elevation where those things are very abundant. It's pretty low amount on the landscape naturally. So if you see a flash, coming up, you can see those signals on that imagery. The better way to do it, is some surveillance, right? So like getting out on your roads, your disturbed areas, a little bit of monitoring so you can catch those patches, as John O'Keefe says, when they're the size of a saddle blanket versus when they've spread across 10,000 acres.
Sorry to keep going with the questions. That's one of the reasons I'm here, is I'm not afraid to ask dumb questions.
Yeah.
When you're talking about, you'd naturally see annuals in the higher elevation and riparians, what kind of annuals are you talking about there? When we say annuals, my mind goes to cheatgrass all the time, but
Chad, you guys have done a lot of work on, the amount of annuals and native plant species. We have annual forbs are a common component of our rangelands. I'm not a species guy, so Chad could probably list a few of those off, but we have a lot of annual forbs when you get in those more productive pieces of ground, or you'll see them flush after a really wet year or a fire. I don't know if you have anything there, Chad.
Yeah, you mentioned that they're at the last. The thing that can be maddening about annuals is just how responsive they are to annual conditions, right? And so in this surveillance, in the stethoscope approach, I think one of the things that's really important is to keep in mind that we're going to have annuals within the annual grass zone. I just always assume that we have annuals, and if you don't think you do, burn it and see what happens next. But where within those areas are the most intact, and doing that, doing those annual evaluations, as Jeremy says, with the idea that we're going to have some plus or minus here between years. There are years that are just good annual years. And forbs are the same way. You look at a lot of John Bates's work from the research station here. You want to manage for forbs, wait for the right year, because year has a controlling effect on forb abundance, just like it does on annual grass abundance. So that's really the tricky piece in finding those spots that you want to get on, is in evaluating where the plant community is at. Did we just have a really wet year? Was it? And it's not just precipitation. It's what temperature was like. Was a winter cold enough to kill? This year around Burns, we had a great fall cheatgrass crop. It all died in the winter, right? So every year is different, and that's something you want to keep in mind when you're thinking about how much do I want to raise the red flag on this site. Is this a good year for cheatgrass, or the inverse too? This is a bad year for cheatgrass, but I'm still seeing it in this fairly intact site. That would probably be one that you would want to raise the red flag on. But just keeping in mind that annual year-to-year variability in weather conditions.
Yeah, and that's a great segue, Chad, to talking about some of the products here that people can use in assessing this, like at your ranch or pasture scale. If you go on RAP and you look at the every single year of annual foreign grass cover, you're going to see exactly what Chad described, a lot of variation because of moisture and temperature conditions. One thing that we developed, partnerships developed to help address that is like we'll take 3 or 4 years of annual grass data and merge it into one, kind of give you like an average condition of what you would expect, quote, in on average. It takes some of the noise out of there. So if you go to the RAP landing page, there's a link to a layer that's been developed on that. I'll show you those quick. We've got you know, the RAP landing page that folks here are probably familiar with. If you go to partner tools, there's one here that gives you that kind of average condition over a series of years. The one I'll use today, if you go to the Working Lands for Wildlife or WLFW.org, we've got a whole page of information on like how we're thinking about strategically tackling this problem. We've got some videos that you could watch on like, what we're going to talk about here. And then if you go to the spatial data, there's this whole layer that's the same type of average annual condition across the landscape. So this takes some of that noise out of it and makes it a little easier to develop a kind of multi-year plan. So we're going to actually go into this particular product right now. And because we're with Dave, and this isn't too far from where Chad and I live, Elko, Nevada is here. Here's the highway, right? Interstate 80. And I'm just going to turn on that annual herbaceous layer that covers the years 2020, 2021, and 2022. So this is kind of mean conditions. And when we map, we're using the RAP data, annual foreign grass data. Like I mentioned before, this includes some of our native annuals, but we think it's a pretty good surrogate for things like cheatgrass, medusa head, and ventenata because we don't naturally have a lot of native annual cover on our arid rangelands. So here's what you're looking at. Here's Elko again, right in the center of the screen. These white areas, some of these areas are just cropped out because they're like developed or irrigated lands or riparian areas or high elevation forests or something. Everything that's colored up here is representing the amount in terms of canopy cover of annual herbaceous species. So green is like 0 or near 0. So very low, like on the low end. And as Chad said, I'm sure it's contaminated with seed in this part of the world, but at this scale with RAP, it's telling you it's pretty low, pretty low. As you get yellow and orange, you're getting more and more and more cover, upwards of probably 20+% by the time you get to that orange color. And then you get to red, and those are your more cheatgrass dominated areas, 40, 50+% cover. And so, even at this scale, which is big for most people, you're thinking about this giant area around Elko. You notice the patterns, right? It's not all equally infested. And so I was just going to pick a spot, and we'll just pretend we're going to go down to like something that more resembles possibly a ranch or a pasture scale. Oops, let me back out. Okay, that's a little more comfortable. How does that look?
Yeah.
So if I were to turn this off, you'd be able to recognize drainage names and mountain ranges. Here's Susie Creek. You probably know some of that country, Dave. And let's assume Jeremy knows how to work GIS, and I can actually do a little box for us. And again, we're just throwing out an example, but imagine you brought in your pasture boundary, your ranch boundary, and this is your decision space, right? This is the area that you have management control over. Okay. What do you notice about this? If we were to start developing an invasive, long-term invasive annual grass management program, and instead of chasing the ambulance, we wanted to go in for our annual checkup and start there and then move out, which part of this pasture or ranch would we start in?
So my guess would be that that clear distinction between red and yellow to the west.
Yep. There's a really hard line here. There's something going on with elevation or a historic burn or something happened here. And we kind of got this other thing here. You know, maybe there's some south slopes or something that are a little bit more heavy on the annual grass than this country down in here, right? And so we could actually start to do my favorite exercise, like what could we do on a napkin at a bar and come up with a plan. You could just take and draw out, like, you know, this is kind of like maybe our best ground today.
And just a placeholder, Jeremy, if at some point you could just quickly turn the EcoStates on.
Yep. Let me turn off this thing. All right, so this is just looking at annual species, right? So we've identified the area with the lowest amount of annuals, kind of this big blob. And I'm a lumper, not a splitter. So I'm going to say that's the area, that's my core that I want to defend. This other stuff, we're going to have to work on it long term because it's already pretty bad. So now I'm going to turn on this another layer, RAP derived. Chad and his colleagues developed this concept of a threat-based EcoState mapping where essentially, I don't know, Chad, this is on now. Do you want to explain that? Can you see the legend well?
Sure. So state A is going to be basically what we want in 3 words. It's going to be a sagebrush bunchgrass plant community that has where the interspaces are going to be dominated by bare ground instead of annuals. If we start to add annuals to that plant community, where are we most likely to see them? We're most likely to see them in that bare ground between perennial bunch grasses, right? When they start to when they get close to dominating that bare ground, in other words, we got more annual cover than bare ground between the perennials, that we would call that a state A to C. Where we've got kind of intermediate conditions, sagebrush bunchgrass, and that's that lighter green that you see. If we get enough annuals in the plant community, and this is kind of the other end of the continuum, and very few to no shrubs and annuals dominate the plant community, we'd call that a state D, right? So the state D is going to be those red areas that you see that Jeremy's pointing to. But we can also have something that's kind of intermediate in terms of management concern, and that's the yellowish areas that you see, and that's what we call a poor condition shrubland. And these are basically perennial bunchgrass, sagebrush plant communities that have, for whatever reason, lost most of their perennial understory. And the understory either is bare ground, or in many cases, it's going to be annual. So you get this plant community that's got a shrub overstory, so that component's still there, but we got the annual grass understory. And we like to call those zombie communities because they're basically walking dead. The next fire, the sagebrush is going to go away, and what do you get? You get a state D. And the last state that's going to be potentially relevant to this map is our state bees, and state bees happen. They're basically a perennial grassland. Okay, and that happens after a state A, which is our intact perennial bunchgrass shrub community, burns. Shrubs go away, and we're left with the dominance of perennials. If we're left with the dominance of perennials, that would be a state B. And then you notice we have the B to D transition, those kind of pinkish areas. And that's where we've got a perennial grassland, again, generally following fire, but we've got enough annuals to where we're concerned about it crossing a tipping point and going towards that annual grass monoculture, which again, we call a state D.
So you can kind of toggle between these two and you know, see different value added by, this is just one dimension. This is one variable, the annual herbaceous cover. And then if you add in other information about the perennial plant community, you get a little different picture where you go, well, maybe we would have extended that line down around here. And you could modify this based on the additional information you see there.
Yeah.
Can I jump in here with a question?
Yep.
Yeah.
First of all, what did you call that second type of map?
This is the threat-based EcoState map that Oregon State University, ARS, have put together. Everything you see in this, these are both RAP-derived products. And what I mean by RAP-derived is we took the raw RAP data and we just put it into a format that we wanted to visualize the world. And so these are things that are somewhat available on web viewers now, but they're becoming increasingly available through, you know, partner portals and things. So I pulled them into GIS, you know, so if you're a rancher and you need some assistance with this, we've got people that you could sit down with and pull these maps up on your ranch today. Hopefully we'll get them in a web viewer where anyone can view them for free anytime soon and do this type of exercise.
And Dave, the states themselves, they're just mental placeholders, you know. There's probably not, most plant communities don't neatly fit into one of those boxes, but there's infinite variability in plant composition. So we just need, as humans, some mental placeholders that we can say a plant community that generally is an intact sagebrush bunchgrass plant community is a state A. And more than anything else, that gives us a good communication point to where we can begin to talk about complex landscapes. You know, when we say the same state A, I know what you're talking about, you know what I'm talking about. It's just a communication tool.
So that's a great segue to this question. Are you finding that map correlates well with state and transition models? Is your state A comparable to the reference state on a state and transition model?
Well, yes and no. The reference states, a lot of them are not going to recognize the modified nature of the ecosystem. Where, you know,
not reference state, but like current state, current potential.
Yeah, I think that it's pretty easy to find analogs between the two. You know, I think of them as, I usually call them buckets. State A is just kind of a bucket where we throw a generalized plant community composition, and you're going to find analogous buckets in other state and transition models as well.
I'm seeing a real positive connection there because it can be difficult to go out and look at the ground using state and transition models, but using this and then plugging that into state and transition models would give me a pretty good, I'm guessing it would give me a pretty good idea towards what I could do with that, or maybe shouldn't do anything.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
You bet.
So, you know, speaking to the practitioner and rancher audience, you know, if this was my pasture and I'm thinking about that ambulance and stethoscope diagram I showed you earlier, my first step was to find my best ground, least infected, least invaded. And this is simply from an invasion standpoint. You may have valuable other values you want to protect over here, like mule deer browse or this is my best grazing part of my pasture. That then would inform where you would want to start as well. But you should always anchor in, kind of like fighting a wildfire, have a foot in the black. So you don't want to get surrounded by the problem. What happens or has been happening, and Chad and I are part of a larger group kind of documenting the pace at which cheatgrass is moving. And it's so fast that we're losing, what is it, Chad, like in the Great Basin, Joe Smith's work shows it's like, faster than the rate of Amazon deforestation is how fast we're losing our Great Basin rangelands to invasive cheatgrass. And so we have to change the way we're doing this. What we've been doing is playing whack-a-mole. We'll come over here and we'll have a fire and we'll spend millions on rehab, which is a very good thing to do. But we don't spend the equal amount of time protecting our best ground from ever becoming invaded or getting worse. And so while we're focused over here, this is getting worse. And so the problem keeps getting more and more expensive everywhere. And so our thought behind this proactive approach is to start here, ask ourselves, what could we do in this green to keep it green? And that's a whole suite of management strategies. Then once we've kind of secured that, or simultaneously, we could start moving out. And so we would put the arrow like on the diagram, we'd start here and we'd move this way and move this way and move this way with our management actions, such that over time we're not only defending our best ground, but we're growing it hopefully over time through restoration and multiple treatments that'll probably be needed to get that seed bank under control.
Yeah. Yeah, and we might even think about things like which part of that core area is going to be most vulnerable. And we might identify that kind of southeastern portion and the northeastern portion where you're near a really large seed source. And that might be an area where we want to put additional efforts because we might expect a higher potential for invasion. We might also want to think about how we graze this area. Let's say that we graze the whole dang thing. I would rather go from a core area to an annual grass pasture than go from an annual grass pasture to a core area, just because cattle transport seeds, right? And so that might be a vector for getting more seed into that core area. So those are the kinds of considerations that we might think about. Again, after, as Jeremy's shown, we've established that core area that's going to be our base of operations. It's the black and the fire. It's where we're going to work out from.
And this area over here, we have this kind of mantra of like defend the core first. So go in here, do your annual checkups, your preventative management around roads, water holes, treat this area first. Then grow the core. Like this is looking good, but maybe it's our south slopes that are our worst, most vulnerable places. Could we work on this? This area over here is more of that kind of mitigating our impacts or like containment, right? So we don't want whatever's happened here over time to fully engulf the rest of our ranch or our pasture. So maybe this is that, we switch our whole mindset to like, we're going to dormant season graze this so we don't have fine fuels everywhere. We can reduce the fire likelihood of taking out our best ground. We might have fuel breaks or targeted grazing strips through here. Those types of things could be more mitigation or containment for an area that's already pretty bad.
Yeah, and if this seems simple, that's because it is. And you can make it as complex as you want, but just the basic thought process that Jeremy's outlined here with identify the core, defend that thing, grow it. That's really the change that we're seeking to inspire. Because again, as Jeremy pointed out, if I would have looked at this map 10 years ago, my first thought would have been, oh, we need to go to these red areas and do something about them. And that's generally what we do on Western landscapes. If you look where most of the money and effort goes, it's going to be in these areas that are not core areas. And the basic change that we're suggesting and that Jeremy's been suggesting for a long time is work first in your core. because your odds of success in maintaining that core are a heck of a lot higher than they're going to be in restoring those areas that are non-core, particularly when it comes to annual grasses.
And from a producer's standpoint, I mean, economics matters. The cost of treatment in this area in your core, much lower than dealing with this, where you have to not only treat the annuals multiple times, but you might have to seed it and hope that pray for rain, because that's what drives that success, right? So the cost of prevention is lower. It's not free, but it's lower. Dave, were you going to chime in there?
You covered exactly what I was thinking with that last little bit there.
Yeah, maybe another way to think about this, Jeremy, just hit me, is the whole idea within the annual grass zone is to maintain resistance to annual grasses. How do you do that? You hang on to your perennials. So another way to say what we just described is this is a plan to hang on to your perennials, right? And if you want to do some annual grass treatments, where do you do them? You do them in the areas where they're most likely to have a negative impact on your perennials. And that could either be within the core, where there's maybe a biotic thing going on and they're out competing the perennials, or as Jeremy pointed out, it could be outside the core in an area where you're likely to get a wildfire. And because in that southeastern portion, for example, if you had a lot of potential ignition sources, if there were a highway running through that, man, I'd want to think about what can I do to manage my fuels in such a way that that fire doesn't carry over into the core area.
A couple other key concepts that I would say we've taken for granted is that, you know, your vegetation condition, I think, drives a tremendous amount of that resilience and resistance Chad was referring to. Like this dark green area is telling us, RAP is telling us that's good condition shrubland. So it's got a nice understory, it's got some overstory, it's got the components we want. But if we just relied on that, I think the fallacy in the past has been to just rely on that as like our defense. And what we're learning is that, you know, the other half of the equation, exposure to the invader itself, is really important to take head on. So yes, cheatgrass is already in this area, but if we just assume that those native plants are going to outcompete cheatgrass, I think we're going to find ourselves in a very bad place. And the data and some of Chad's research and is showing that a lot of this invasion is happening without the facilitation of fire. It's simply turning into an annual grassland. And so unless we meet the challenge head on and like literally take on this invasion process, we're not going to stop it. And so that's where, you know, maybe in your next episode, Erica, when you get into talking about tactics and management tools, you know, we do have herbicides. We do have things that are giving us a better fighting chance today to actually deplete that seed bank so that we can have much cleaner pastures, you know, that potentially would give our native plants a chance to reproduce without all that competition early in the spring, right? Those annual grasses germinate in the fall, grow up, and they're there to get the resources first. If you get 8 inches of precip, they get first sip. And so that's really hard on a young blue bunch wheatgrass that's trying to get established. And so if we can give our native plants a leg up, these systems can be very resilient. That's a story I'm hearing out of my colleagues in Wyoming who are doing this at scale. Similar dry landscapes with a lot less invasion. It's amazing what happens when you take cheatgrass out of the system. Our native plants thrive, and we just got to give them a chance.
So I keep coming up with the same question in my notes here, and then you just said it, that invasion is happening without the aid of fire. So when I hear defend the core, I immediately think of protecting an area from fire. Isn't the disturbance from fire exponentially worse than any other vector of invasives coming in? I mean, Is that where we should be focusing on, is preventing the fire disturbance? Or are you saying there's other disturbances that are equally as important as preventing fire, or preventing unmanaged fire?
Well, you'll see this in a title of a paper that's going to come out. I'm going to go ahead and steal the line now from Joe Smith. But fire or cheatgrass, or fire needs cheatgrass more than cheatgrass needs fire.
That's fire.
That's kind of what Jeremy was saying, and that's what we're finding through this collective work with Joe Smith out of the University of Montana, is this stuff's spreading regardless. Now, if you were, regardless of disturbances, it's spreading into intact areas, whether or not they burn. If you were to look at a list of disturbances and think about their relative importance in helping cheatgrass to spread, fire is a big one. And it's not that it's not a natural part of this system, and there are productive uses for fire as we get up in elevation out of the annual grass zone in terms of conifer management. But within the annual grass zone, fire is going to be the disturbance that has the biggest impact, probably spatially, on cheatgrass abundance. But
This has been something we've struggled with, Dave. Chad and I have been part of work groups for 20 years talking about getting a handle on fire. It certainly doesn't help the cheatgrass situation, but what we're realizing now with this new research that is basically behind the scenes helping us learn these things, some large amount, 70 to 80% of these state transitions to annual grasslands are happening without a fire ever happening in history, like recent history. So what we think's happening is we're getting that invasion in those interspaces, that bare ground, and then it just propagates and propagates and propagates and outcompetes the native plant regeneration process. So we have to do both. We have to actually have a fire discussion, but we need to have an equal or even greater discussion about invasive species management.
That's great. I really like that line, that fire needs cheatgrass, grass needs fire. I'll wait for the paper to come out before I use it.
Yeah.
Thank you for recording.
And that was Joe Smith. That came from his brain. Gosh, something you just said triggered me here, Jeremy, in a good way.
Oh, good. Okay.
What did you say last?
I was talking about the need to do both.
Yeah, and you were talking about outcompeting native perennials. Another point that I always like to bring up is basically, how did this pissant little annual grass from the other side of the world come over to the sagebrush biome and outcompete perennials that have been here for literally millions of years? The blue bunch wheatgrass pollen goes back like 2.8 million years ago. And the answer is it changed the ecosystem. It used to be that the species that survived here, that thrived here, were those that could persist, right? And how do you persist in a really variable environment? Well, you do things like develop these massive rooting structures so that whenever you do get precipitation, you can capitalize on it and capture it. That's what determined evolutionary success before cheatgrass. Now what determines evolutionary success is who can reproduce the fastest following disturbance from seed. Well, it turns out that these perennials like blue bunch wheatgrass, being an example, have little wimpy seeds. Why? Because they put all their evolutionary resources in developing these massive underground rooting systems. And so that's why we see annual grasses outcompeting these established native species, even in the absence of fire. Those established native species are bunch grasses, and they have to, at some point, replace themselves in the community as they die. Bunch grasses might live 10, 20 years, sometimes longer, but they do have to replace themselves periodically. And we might get 1 in 10 years. That's a good seed year for that. So you start doing the math, and every year seems to be a good seed year for cheatgrass. That's why we're seeing this expansion even in the absence of fire.
And we've perhaps underestimated the importance of bare ground as a whole discipline in range. I think we actively manage against it as an evil thing, but in this system, that bare ground is a harsh place for a seedling to make a living. In cheatgrass in particular, it has this effect where it builds up so much thatch, or it actually helps itself establish in those inner spaces. So there's some things to think about on the ecology of this invader that I think we can use to our advantage to help manage against it. And that's the exciting part for me, is better unpacking that, and then using our technology and our abilities to help advantage the things we want, those perennial bunch grasses, giving them a chance to get the leg up, to reproduce.
Yeah. You know, and if we were looking at Jeremy's core area there, and we were thinking about prevention, if the first thing we want to do is defend the core, a couple of ways we might start to neck down that much space into manageable chunks. First, we might think about what we call resistance and resilience. And put another way, where are the sites that are lower and drier within that core? Where are the sites that are higher and wetter and cooler, right? And those lower, drier, warmer sites are going to be the areas where we're most likely to see invasion. They're also the areas, and this is important, those are the areas that are the hardest to get back if they convert to annual grasses. So a trick with prevention is to think, where are those areas, not just where we're most likely to see invasion, but where it's going to be hardest to get back if they do convert to annual grasses. And those would be the lower elevation, warmer sites within that core area. And that might, where that intersects, like if we had one of those in the southeast portion of that core area, man, I would be all over that, because that's a site that's going to fairly easily convert, and it's going to be hard to get back once it does. In a second way, we might prioritize within there. And Jeremy, I'm not asking that we go there. Folks can look this up on their own, but there is a wildfire prediction tool for the Great Basin that's also on the RAP site. And long story short, it's becoming fairly well established that the likelihood of wildfire on sagebrush rangelands has to do with the previous 2 years accumulation of fine fuels, right? And it's not as much about the year that those fuels are produced. For example, we had a big production year this year in Harney County. We've had very few fires, knock on wood, so far. That's because those fuels are so green, so long into the season, that you don't have that long of a fire season. Next year, we're going to have an interesting year, because all of the fuels produced this year that weren't eaten are going to be dry enough to burn at the beginning of the fire season next year. And so we worked with the University of Montana and collectively came up with this fine fuels driven fire probability map for the Great Basin. And the cool thing about fires being driven by fine fuels is, in the previous year's fine fuels, is it makes predicting big fire years a little bit of a slow moving freight train. In other words, we can see the conditions coming that would increase the likelihood of big fires, and we can get out in front of those. So one of the things that I would do is use the tool that Jeremy's got on his screen, and you can, on your own, you can zoom into your specific area. In I would do that when the tool comes out in early spring, and say, where are those areas where I've got fine fuel conditions that are most likely to cause a wildfire event? Grazing can be used in those areas. We're actually combining this tool with virtual fencing now to strategically graze relatively high fire likelihood areas. So that gives you another way to think about that core area and think about prevention of fire within it. Prioritize areas. Sorry, Jeremy.
This is Dave. I think what you said speaks directly to the need for flexibility in our grazing plans.
Yeah.
We say that all the time, but I think just like we have a drought management plan, I would call it the overabundance management plan. I'd come up with a better name than that, but when we do have 2 years of stacked up fine fuel loads,
yeah,
we've got to have some flexibility and some way to get more cattle out there and do some really intensive strategic grazing.
That's hard to do, though, isn't it? I mean, when you run a 12-month operation, you suddenly got to push in the clutch and do something different. So there are definite logistical challenges, operational challenges there.
Yeah, from a production standpoint, bringing in yearlings is just such an easy way for us to make that happen. Taking in, and that's another need for flexibility. Taking in some outside cattle in abundance, especially being here in Nevada where we have yearlings so close in California. I would like to see that at some point, a fine fuel load reduction plan that matches the drought management plan.
Well, one cautionary note, I haven't had this conversation much with ranchers, but I think about it because I live in Oregon and we do have a lot of livestock coming out of the Central Valley certain times a year. But, you know, what if we thought about the time of year those animals are coming, if they've got medusa head, ventenata, and every other ugly invasive annual on them when they come? I'd put it back to producers. Think about what could you do to clean them before turning them loose in a pasture, that if it's your best ground, your core, you better be thinking about where that seed's coming from. So again, this exposure idea of where the weed is coming from, I think we've taken for granted that it's just everywhere and beyond control now, but the maps tell us there's still big chunks of the Great Basin that are in pretty good shape still. So we can use our knowledge of that and try to manage our risks.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think we accidentally do that quite a bit because we don't call it a quarantine field. But when cattle come in, you know, they come into usually the central yard, and that's where they're staged until they move out. Some more information about how long those seeds are viable on an animal, and you know, how to reduce the likelihood of that spread, especially cattle coming from California. And I'm not knocking California, but
Yeah.
you know, some more information on that would be pretty helpful.
You should put together your question list for the next call with the specialists on these tactics. There's a lot of people that think deeply about these things and understand that ecology. And there's a bunch of stuff we still don't know. I mean, quite honestly. So it's a fair question.
If I may ask real quickly on just a strategic question again, without getting into, you know, treatments and tactics, looking at our core and then looking at our border area, if you have an expensive treatment like spraying, would you consider that expansion area the place to invest the most? I mean, I know that you want to protect the core, but maybe you employ, you know, your grazing strategies and other more cost-effective strategies while also maybe spot spraying. But if you're going to go apply a broad scale expensive treatment rather than, like you said, the temptation to run to the worst spot, are you seeing that that's where it's most effective to really invest if you're looking at a costly investment?
Great question. You know, if this was my place and my money, I would want to ground truth this and get out in this area and take a look see and go, you know, how bad is it? These yellow spots could be 50, 100 acres, depending on the scale we're talking about here. So you might actually have to aerially treat even small areas within this core. That would be the best thing you could do first. Call it spot spraying or spot aerial application. Then, like you say, this west side of the pasture over here, maybe you do, you know, treat the whole thing. That's the more expensive action. But I wouldn't take your eye off of your core to chase this around in hopes that this is going to get better, because you can't graze out cheatgrass, in my view, because if you graze it, it still goes to seed, whether it's an inch or 10 inches. We can manage against it. We can keep it at low levels, I think, effectively. But if I was looking to eradicate or like keep it at less than 1% of my pasture, I would be looking at herbicides that would directly take on the seed source.
But just to expand a little bit on that, if I was going to use, let's say it's a rejuver treatment outside of this core area, the first thing I would do is to think about how could we grow the core area by spraying outside of the core area. And that's something that I would focus on, but I would also, that's on one side of the scale. On the other side of the scale, and I put my prevention hat on, I would think about fire and how does fire move? How has it moved historically across these landscapes? You know, if we've got a west to east pattern, then that would argue for doing my treatments as close as I can to core within the yellow areas to the west of the core area. And just the inverse, if it tends to move from east to west, you know, I might want to expand that core area on the east side at that point. So just a couple of things to think about. And
That's a great point. We've got anecdotes. Paul Myman had a grad student out of Wyoming have an accidental learning opportunity on his degree where a fire went through on a rejuva treatment and totally changed the fire behavior. And so it's amazing what bare ground gaps between plants do when on fire spread. That continuity is a big issue on rangelands. And so, like Chad said, thinking about a strategic area alongside, you know, when you know your prevailing winds and where fire typically comes from could be a way to very good use of resources early on. Knowing you can't treat every acre right out of the gate. One other saying that I learned from some friends out in the Great Plains that are dealing with a totally different invader, Eastern red cedar, but we're using the same approach, called this defend the core, is we say have a plan for every acre. And what we mean by that is, like, if this is your planting area, this whole pasture or ranch, what do we do in a typical restoration plan? We'll draw a polygon here, we'll draw one here. We have no explicit plan for this green area because it's good, right? Well, what we're saying now is let's go ahead and label every area in this whole box. What's our plan here? What's our plan here? What's our plan here? Knowing that we might only start with this first or that first. But if you don't make it explicit that this is your top priority, where we're actually, and we're going to do these things in there. My ranch hand's going to drive up and down these roads and give me a GPS location of every single spot infestation they see. That's what we're going to do every year. And then this area, we're going to start here. We're going to work our way down, treating, you know, trying to prevent that prevailing wind fire from affecting our core. Okay. But that part of this is a new way of conservation planning, I think, that doesn't just play whack-a-mole and you draw a polygon here and then you spray it and then you go, oh, shoot, it's now over here. That's a big breakthrough in the way we're thinking about this too.
So you mentioned new way of conservation planning, Jeremy, just to make a point. Jeremy and I are both part of a group that's loosely called the Sagebrush Conservation Design Group, and we put out a publication, USGS open file report, about this time last year. And it kind of gets at why we're suggesting a new way of thinking about management. And the bottom line from that report is, if you look at core areas, growth opportunity areas, which are largely intact, and other rangelands, which are things like annual grass dominated plant communities, we're losing 1.3 million acres a year across the biome on average every year over the last 20 years of core and growth opportunity habitat as it converts to other rangelands. 1.3 million acres a year. That's not sustainable. And that's really driving the idea of how do we think differently about these landscapes. And it's not to undervalue what we've done so far. What we've done so far has been valiant. It's been worthwhile. It's been a massive effort. It's not been effective enough to offset 1.3 million acres of loss a year. And that's really what's driving this concept of strategic conservation. And back to the topic of the day, the only reason we can do strategic conservation is these tools like RAP. They allow us to envision landscapes, not just at big spatial scales, but over time, and to implement the ideas of strategic conservation in complex landscapes, big landscapes. So.
Yeah, it's glad you brought that up, Chad. And, you know, this idea of cores isn't just about preserving sagebrush communities that are native and uninvaded. I mean, that I love them. I'm a native Nevadan. I have sagebrush in my veins, but these are the most productive parts of our rangelands. This is where ranches are going to make a living. and not get burnt out every other season. There's real economic and social costs to not changing what we're doing and doing it fast. And so we're trying to align the partnerships, the producers, the resources to say, no offense, but we're going to have to flip our model and start on our best ground, move out from there, because this is such a fast moving enemy that unfortunately I think we're going to lose if we don't do it quick.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jeremy. I mean, functional intact ecosystems, which is really our goal here. Well, that's why I work for the Agricultural Research Service, and I'm working on projects like the sagebrush conservation design. It's because the number one enemy to not just sage grouse but to ranches is probably, well, the top three are cheatgrass, expanding conifer, and wildfire, and that's what strategic conservation helps us to wrap our brain around, whether we're servicing values that include sage grouse or whether we're looking more at an agronomic perspective and helping ranches to stay productive over time. It's kind of the same thing.
No, I was just thinking about the economic viability of those three things: cheatgrass, conifer invasion, and fire. And without the relationship between cheatgrass and fire, I don't feel like that's the economic driver towards bankruptcy.
Yeah.
I've been accused of liking cheatgrass before, and I'm not saying that I like it, but I use it. You know, it's there. This invasive forage that I can make use out of, and if it weren't for its relationship to fire, I don't know how bad it would be economically. There's a lot of other factors, don't get me wrong, but
that's a very valid viewpoint that's shared by other producers. And you know, it kind of is context dependent is how I would describe that. Is so if you're a rancher in Battle Mountain and everything around you is cheatgrass, of course you sustain your entire livelihood off of that. So do the producers on the Snake River Plain. But if you're in Wyoming, where it's still relatively intact and you can see the Great Basin's nightmare coming your way, you don't want it at all. So it's this slow erosion of expectations that happens over decades because we can't control it. And what you're left with is a less productive ranch that catches on fire frequently. Your public allotments are shut down for years so you can rest. I mean, it's this really bad self-fulfilling thing once it gets going at scale.
For sure. And I don't want to sound like I'm out there, you know, Johnny Cheatgrass eating everything. But
we know you don't love it, Dave. I mean, you're just admitting a reality of many ranchers, I'm sure, do use it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of the sleeping giant here when you do get cheatgrass, though, is the giant of a question is what comes next. And, you know, part of the answer to that we've seen in Oregon is medusa head. And that's a lot less friendly to grazing than cheatgrass is. And who knows what's going to come next. I mean, 15 years ago, I didn't know what ventenata was. I do now. So that's the other piece of it. When you get control, when you manage for functional ecosystems, you're managing against those species. And that's really what we're trying to do here is put the ecosystem processes back together in a way that we don't create favorable environments for whatever invasive comes along next.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I just want to reiterate, I'm not pro cheatgrass. I see after years of really looking into this kind of stuff, I see the importance of diversity, and I see the importance of that functioning ecosystem like I may not have seen when I was younger. Just wanted to plug the usefulness of it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and grazing plays to me a central role in helping with cheatgrass management. You know, as Jeremy pointed out, the odds of grazing it out of a plant community are probably about the same as spraying it out of a plant community and have it stay gone. But that doesn't mean you can't manage it, and that doesn't mean you can't manage things like fire risk while having a forage base, you know, for your cattle. So the grazing it's to me, it's not just the economic benefit that ranchers can get from the cheatgrass resource, which is great, but it's the idea that cattle can be a management tool to help us to limit the consequences of having that kind of fine fuel continuity across the landscape and impacting our core areas when it does catch fire.
I'm going to ask a question I may not want to know the answer to. I have come around as well on not being able to graze cheatgrass out. Since that's the case, or we're going to assume here that that's the case, are we causing more problems by managing cheatgrass through grazing and spreading? Is that a possibility, that the benefit we're getting from grazing it targeted and otherwise is confounded by spreading it worse?
Well, it's certainly possible from a weed vector standpoint. That's one of the ways that cheatgrass spreads. But I guess where I would take that, and I'm a little bit of a broken record here, is what I really focus on is more the how do we maintain perennials. Honestly, as much or more so than I focus on how do we get rid of cheatgrass. And to the extent that grazing can play a role in helping us to maintain those perennials, biofuels reduction, by being flexible and when we graze and how we graze, to perhaps use grazing as a tool to begin to favor those perennials. And some of the work that Kirk Davies has shown indicates that, yeah, that's something that we can probably do. I think those benefits offset, just me, if I were to generalize, the weed vector issue, but they don't do away with the weed vector issue. And that really goes back on the producer. Thinking about how you graze your cattle, thinking about the time, that grazing those relatively intact areas before you go into the cheatgrass rather than the other way around. That's a big deal, and it's going to continue to be a big deal as we go forward.
Great. Grazing our deep-rooted perennials may be just as important as how we how we target graze the annuals. I really liked your answer, and I feel good about it. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, the litter management is something that I've had my eyes open to. Barry Perryman and folks talking about in these systems where you have coexistence of both cheatgrass and perennials, this idea of creating a less favorable environment for cheatgrass, I think is a valuable tool to be thinking about, and grazing can play a role in reducing that litter, making it less likely that germination can happen in the inner spaces and whatnot. If you're in, again, context matters. If you're in Wyoming and you go to the sagebrush country and you don't find cheatgrass, like huge areas without obvious cheatgrass, they're talking about literally not allowing seeding after fire because the number one source of cheatgrass introduction is the seed that they bought and they're applying on after fire, because cheatgrass isn't a noxious species. It's contaminated most of our seed, our native seed. And so you're hearing talk like that in places that don't have much of it at all. I think that's a novel concept, in terms of like, let's keep it out of our system here.
Yeah. And another aspect of that, because this comes up, is you'll hear certain folks saying, well, yeah, we got too much cheatgrass, grazing causes cheatgrass, we need to remove grazing, right? Sounds logical. We could remove all the grazing in the western states right now. We're not going to get rid of cheatgrass. We're probably going to make it worse due to increasing fire. And I say that as a person who manages the research range, where we have 13 grazing exclosures that have been in place since the late 1930s. And we don't see any difference in cheatgrass inside or outside of our grazing exclosures until they burn. And if you burn inside and outside those exclosures, a lot more cheatgrass inside the grazing exclosure that hasn't been grazed since the late 1930s. Why is that? It's because you get fuel accumulation. You get fuel accumulation. It makes more for a more severe fire. It takes out perennials. It creates that space in the plant communities. It's no longer occupied by perennials. Here come the annuals. So in a larger context, not just the weed vector thing, but we're not going to get rid of cheatgrass by getting rid of grazing. I think we're going to do just the opposite. And some of the work that's hopefully going to come out next year, looking at kapukas, areas, are you familiar with kapukas, Dave? They're areas on the landscape surrounded by lava flows that just don't get grazed. And what we're finding, what others are finding, is you find a lot of cheatgrass in those kapukas. You find a lot of cheatgrass outside of those kapukas. And I guess my summary point there would be, it's not 1850 anymore. The cheatgrass cat is out of the bag. It's loose, and we're doing something as simple as passively managing through not grazing is not going to make it go away.
Well, I like how this conversation has turned. That's great.